Hi guys, one of the things that I believe is that everyone has a story, and furthermore I believe that no matter who you are, your story is powerful. And one of the main reasons your story is powerful is because it tells you who you are. And of course we're always changing and we grow and mature and we're dynamic, but our stories shape who we are and who we are becoming. That's what makes stories powerful. And it's important to notice because it's not just you and your story telling you who you are that shapes you and forms you. There's bigger stories as well, or meta stories. Other people want to tell you their story, hoping to shape you, to form you, to influence you. Could be our culture, could be government, could be your workplace, your family, marketing companies. And some of these other stories, bigger stories, meta stories, can be very helpful and others less so. And I actually think that God has a story. And I think that God's story tells us who we are meant to be and why we do what we do. And you go, oh yeah, I know what, God just wants me to do X, Y, and Z and not do A, B, and C. And actually, I think that who God says humanity is might surprise you. I believe that inside the story of God is the story of us, the story of humans, which reveals interesting and really, I think, quite profound facets of our identity. And one of those facets of our identity is our prophetic identity. So I believe that all humans have the potential for a prophetic identity, and that flows from the heart of God to confront evil, to stop exploitation, and to bring comfort. So we have seen what can happen if you've been watching other videos in this series. We've seen what can happen when we attempt to fix what's broken in our own strength. The example that was used was when Moses, the archetypal Hebrew Bible prophet, sees injustice taking place in Egypt and he murders an Egyptian slave driver. Kind of creates more problems than what he was solving. But also in the story of Moses, we see how Moses encountering God and learning more about God's heart and learning more about God's name and entering into a deep, intimate relationship with God, that released something in Moses, leading to his prophetic ministry, bringing people into greater freedom and greater flourishing, truly setting people free. And so we've been going through that journey, and today we're going to be looking at the idea of lament and grief in the context of our prophetic identity, which might seem strange when I first say that. Okay, we're going from this idea of who Moses is and Moses' meeting with God to talking about these complex emotions of lament and grief and even anger and how that fits into our prophetic identity. So yes, it seems strange on the surface, but if you think about it, in a broken world, grief is a big part of our story. Like, that's what makes us sad. We're sad because things go wrong, because things are broken. And so grief is a big part of our story. And lament, I think, provides a prophetic framework which grows us and even helps us to become more like God. So that's what we're going to be exploring. And we're going to be reading from a lesser-known prophet from the Hebrew Bible, Micah. And I'm going to read to you from Micah chapter 6 and then Micah chapter 7. Micah chapter 6 verse 6 says, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Listen, the Lord is calling to the city, and to fear your name is wisdom. Heed the rod and the one who appointed it. Am I still to forget your ill-gotten treasures, your wicked house, and the short ephah, which is accursed? Shall I acquit someone with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? Your rich people are violent, your inhabitants are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully." Okay, now Micah chapter 7. "Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all of our iniquities into the depths of the sea. You will be faithful to Jacob and show love to Abraham, as you pledge on oath to our ancestors in days long ago. So, we've been looking at the archetypal prophet of the Hebrew Bible, which is Moses. And the story of Moses is so important as a prophetic figure that other prophets in the Hebrew Bible, they validate their calling by plugging into Moses' story. Effectively, what they're saying is, I am a prophet of God, and you can trust that I'm a prophet of God because my story connects to Moses' story. And we see this with this lesser-known prophet, Micah. Micah, just to give you some background, he's living in Judah in the divided kingdom. So Israel split into Israel and Judah. And at this time, Micah, he sees economic and spiritual exploitation in both kingdoms, in Judah and Israel. And he plugs into the story of Moses to speak against that injustice which is happening amongst God's people. And he uses the imagery of God meeting with Israel and Moses at Mount Sinai, where God's name was and his nature were revealed. And let me read to you the passage from Micah again, Micah chapter 6, verse 8, which is probably the most famous verse from the book of Micah, quite well known. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. He has shown you, O human, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. So, society has often tried to discount or put a lid on anger and grief. It discounts anger and discounts grief as kind of counterproductive emotions. And even if you think about it, a lot of our culture, like our advertising and marketing and kind of our self-help therapy, is kind of geared towards distraction or amusement so that we don't have to sit with these complex emotions of anger and grief and lament. So we have, a whole kind of amusement industry. The word amuse comes from muse, which means think, and which is the negation or not. So amusement is literally not thinking. And a lot of our world, in Melbourne at least, is the way we deal with these complex emotions. It's not uncommon to throw ourselves into busyness rather than think about how we're feeling, about our anger or our grief or our lament. Rather than processing and dealing with those emotions, we just get busy, or we go into various forms of escapism, amusement, or we buy things, or we do all sorts of different things to numb ourselves from those feelings. And I think that's even true in the church. In the church, we can rush through these feelings of anger and grief. But taking that grief, taking that anger and lamenting is a great skill that unleashes our prophetic imagination. And I get this kind of idea from a well-known Hebrew Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann, and his book, The Prophetic Imagination. And basically, in experiencing anger and grief, what happens is, and when we process that, when we lament that, we're moved to realize there must be something more. There must be something more. I'm angry about this situation where people are being exploited, and there must be something more. God, you must not be happy with this. What can we do together to see this brokenness and this exploitation taken care of? In experiencing anger and grief, we're moved to say the status quo is not good enough. There must be something more. And before we were in apathy, not caring, or amusement, not thinking, we're motivated by lament to move towards a vision of something better. To not lament means we settle for the status quo, which would be to say that if we saw or experienced injustice and exploitation around us, then we would just think, by not lamenting, this is just the way it's always going to be. This is the nature of the world. We just need to accept and make peace that brokenness is the fundamental nature of things. In contrast to that, God has told us what he wants from us: justice, loving kindness, and humility. And it's interesting to me that these characteristics, justice, loving kindness, and humility, they line up with the nature of God. Okay, Micah chapter 7, the first parts of verses 18 and 19. Who is a God like you who pardons sin and forgiveness? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. So, acknowledging our experiences of anger and grief as we lament is part of emotional authenticity. And emotional authenticity is vital for any relationship to go deep. Emotional authenticity, as we process anger and grief and lament, I think builds our relationship with each other and with God. If you think about it, desperation feeds our hunger for God and our reliance on Him. And the power and purpose in experiencing a deeper intimacy with God, or the power and purpose that comes from a deeper intimacy with God, can't be underestimated. And notice how Micah, in chapter 7, he's dwelling on God's character. God shows his character in the story of Moses in Exodus 34 verse 6. He says his name, Yahweh, I am, compassionate, I am forgiving, I am slow to anger. The passage that we read earlier is a lament by Micah about the current state of Israel. Israel, they've been assuming that God wants their religious systems of sacrifices, and that's good enough, and that God will ignore their cheating, their deception, and their violence. But Israel's forgotten God's true nature and heart, and that's what Micah is lamenting. Somehow the people of God thought that God wanted olive oil and meat instead of justice and love. And that tendency of Israel to go to ritual, which can have its own kind of issues of bondage and injustice, but the tendency of Israel to move towards empty ritual, I think that's a human thing. To me, it's interesting how humans tend to replace intimacy with God with things. Let's just give God things. Let's just go into this transaction. No, if you think about what's a deep relationship and what's a shallow relationship, a transactional relationship is a shallow relationship. Israel wanted a transactional relationship with God. God wanted a deep relationship with them. And a deep relationship meant prioritizing justice, humility, and loving kindness. So Micah, he's doing this hard work of connecting to the story of Moses and lamenting the state of Israel. But it's not just the Hebrew Bible that talks about the concept of lament and mourning. But actually there's another prophet that is promised in the Hebrew Bible, Jesus, who in the New Testament, in his famous Beatitudes sermon on a mountain, delivering the words of God, once again, this imagery, this allusion to the story of Moses, Jesus also talks about those who mourn. And in fact, he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." So we've seen repeatedly that God has a heart of compassion. And when we are lamenting, I think God moves to comfort us. I think that's what Matthew chapter 5, verse 4 says. That's what Jesus says. We have continual opportunities to experience God's comfort as we lament well. And lamenting well means we see stuff that's happening out there to other people. We see stuff and we feel stuff that's happening inside of us, to us. And rather than just bottling it, or rather than just kind of imbuing it with bitterness and cynicism, we acknowledge the authenticity of our feelings and we bring it to God and say, God, I don't think this is the way things should be. And when we do that, God responds to us in comfort. Maybe in our efforts to numb and avoid pain, in our efforts to be amused, in our efforts to be distracted, maybe we've missed those opportunities for God to come and comfort us. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he says that mourners or lamenters are blessed, which is quite a shocking thing to say, quite countercultural, quite counterintuitive. But I want to ask this question. If that's true, if what Jesus is saying is true, what are we missing by not lamenting? What are we turning to be distracted with instead of reflecting deeply on the pain we feel when we witness and experience and perhaps partake in exploitation? So what are these things that we're going to instead of God? And then what are we missing out on when we're going to those distractions? What are we missing out on when we don't reflect deeply on the pain that we feel when we witness exploitation and brokenness, and we don't bring that to God? What are we missing out on when we experience exploitation and how it makes us feel, the anger and the grief and the lamenting and those complex emotions, when we don't bring that to God? What are we missing out on? And even what are we missing out on when we partake in exploiting other people and we don't bring the grief that we did that to God and lament, and we ask Him to work in us? I think maybe that makes us numb towards God and towards each other. When we see injustice, I think it should move us to lament. And that lament should motivate us to act with compassion and comfort those in need. That's not the way it should be. That I am not happy with the status quo. It shouldn't be like that. And I'm not going to put up with it. I'm going to offer compassion and comfort. And I also think it's an opportunity when we lament well. If lament takes us to compassion, and if God is the God who says in Exodus 34 verse 6 to Moses, I am compassionate, I think that lament gives us the opportunity to be like God. If lament drives us to compassion and God is compassionate, then if we lament well, we can actually become more like God. Lament can motivate humans in their prophetic identity to be more like the prophetic God. But that's just what I think. I wonder what you think, and to maybe get the discussion going, here are some questions. First group of questions. When you look at the world today, what situations move you to grief or lament? They could be big ones, they could be little ones. Could be geopolitical, could be what's happening in your neighborhood. Have you ever experienced a time when bringing grief or frustration to God deepened your relationship with Him? What was that like? Second group of questions. What do you think it means that lament is a part of our prophetic identity? What's that connection in your own words? And why do you think people and even churches sometimes avoid grief or anger or lament? And how might grief about injustice, how is that lament actually helpful? How might that help us imagine something better? Finally, what might it look like this week to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God in a practical way? If that's what God wants. If God doesn't want a transactional relationship where we just bring Him stuff and we do religious rituals, but He wants relationship, what does it actually look like? And if lament helps us reflect God's heart, if it's actually a good thing, if lament actually helps us to grow in our prophetic identity and to represent the prophetic God more accurately to the community around us, if lament helps us in those ways, how can we cultivate healthier ways of lamenting together as a community? How can you help me and how can I help you lament in a healthy way, such that our prophetic identity as human beings, according to the story of God, can grow and fully develop? Anyway, there's some food for thought, some questions to discuss. Love to hear your feedback. Thanks, guys.